In this video, we're going to look at solving a quadratic equation by either factoring or using the square root property. Now, solving a quadratic equation by factoring is just one of many ways of solving a quadratic equation. So we'll look at two different ways of solving this one, both by factoring and using the square root property. So example 1, we have x minus 2 squared equals 400. Now I could FOIL x minus 2 squared and then make it as a trinomial and then factor it, but I think it would be a lot quicker if you use the square root property. And the square root property just says when you have a square by itself, you're going to undo the square by finding the square root of both sides. So here, to undo this square, I'm going to find the square root of this side and the square root of that side. Square root of x minus 2 squared, the radical and the square undo each other, and then I'm left with x minus 2 equaling, and the square root of 400 is a positive 20 and a negative 20. And then all I have to do is get x by itself. To do that, I'm going to add 2 to both sides. And because I have two solutions, I'm going to add 2 to both numbers. And my solution would be x is equal to, not 40, this should be 22. And it could also be a negative 18. Now I can verify it by plugging those numbers into my equation. So if I did 22 minus 2, that's 20. 20 squared is 400. Negative 18 minus 2 is negative 20. Negative 20 squared is also a positive 400. So my two solutions would be x equaling positive 22 and negative 18. Example 2. Here I want to get the square by itself, so I'm going to subtract 1 first on both sides, and I have 3x squared equaling 24. To get x squared by itself, I'm going to divide by 3. And I'm left with x squared equaling 24 divided by 3 is 8. To undo a square, I find the square root of both sides. That leaves me with x is equal to, and I'm going to break this down. This would be the square root of 4 times the square root of 2, and the square root of 4 is 2. So I know it's going to be a positive and a negative 2 square root of 2. Just keep in mind when you do find a square root of a number, you're going to have a positive root and a negative root. Example 3, here we are going to factor them. So this one, example 3, that one's already factored. So all I would have to do is just make each binomial equal to 0. Because if one of them is 0, 0 times another number is going to equal 0. So now I have q plus 7 equals 0, and I have q minus 4 equals 0. To solve for q here, I'm going to subtract 7. So if q is a negative 7, I'm going to make the whole equation equal to 0. And on the other side, I'm going to add 4 to both sides. And I have q equaling a positive 4. So whether q is a negative 7 or a positive 4, it will make the whole equation equal to 0. Example 4. Here I'm going to make this as a trinomial, so I'm going to subtract 18 on both sides, and I'm left with z squared minus 3z minus 18 equaling 0. So now I have to think, what do I multiply to get negative 18, but if I add them together, it gives me a negative 3. So since my c is negative, I know one of these numbers is positive and one's negative. I know that 6 times 3 is 18, and if I did a positive 3 and a negative 6, that's going to give me a negative 18, and 3 minus 6 gives me a negative 3. So now I can make each of them equal to 0 and solve. So here I'm going to subtract 3, and z is going to equal a negative 3. Now on this side, I'm going to add 6 to both sides, and I'm left with z equaling a positive 6. So my two solutions here would be negative 3 and positive 6. So that is how you can solve quadratic equations by factoring and using the square root property.